All right, so let's get right into it. There's a massive geopolitical shift happening. And while everyone is laser-focused on the US and China, this really fascinating analysis argues there's a surprise winner emerging. And not just on the sidelines, but as the absolute linchpin of America's entire industrial strategy. And that winner? It's South Korea. Let's dive in.
To really get why this is happening now, you have to understand the world we're living in. The word you hear everywhere is hyper-uncertainty. You know, all those old assumptions about globalization, about how trade makes everyone friends, that's all getting tossed out the window. We're in the middle of a huge structural break from the post-Cold War world. And yeah, just like it says here, the old maps just don't work anymore.
So what does this new world look like? Well, this analysis frames it as a super high-stakes chicken game between America and China. On one side, you've got the US basically weaponizing its economy to decouple from and contain China. And on the other side, you have a China that's kind of stuck. It's caught between what some analysts call a parasitic growth model, meaning it grew by feeding off other markets, and this really dangerous peaking power trap. That's the fear that a country gets most aggressive right when it knows its best days are behind it. It's basically a collision course.
And that brings us to the first really crucial idea behind this whole argument, the peak China theory. The point here isn't just that China's economy has slowed down a bit. No, the argument is that it has slammed into a hard developmental ceiling. And crucially, its leaders know it. So let's break down why.
So this aggressive American strategy, it's really rooted in a theory that some call the parasite model. The idea, argued most famously by Peter Navarro, is that China's economic miracle wasn't really its own. Instead, it was completely dependent on a host, the open US market. It suggests that the growth was fueled by things like IP theft, ignoring regulations, and huge government subsidies. So the logic goes, if you separate the parasite from the host, it just can't survive on its own.
And right now, the evidence suggests China is really vulnerable. I mean, forget the US for a second, just look internally. They're facing a perfect storm. Their local governments are drowning in debt. They're staring down a full-blown demographic collapse, not enough young workers, and Xi Jinping's big plan to get the Chinese people to spend more, this dual circulation strategy, has basically failed because the real estate crash just wiped out so much of the middle class's wealth.
So, does this mean war is coming? You know, that's the classic fear, right? A declining power lashes out. But the analysis here offers a pretty compelling reality check. You might have seen those reports about recent purges in the Chinese military, the ones about missiles literally filled with water instead of fuel. Well, that points to some deep systemic corruption. You combine that with a total lack of modern combat experience, and suddenly an all-out war becomes a massive gamble, one that could easily end the regime if it went sideways.
Okay, so if China is hitting a wall and the US is actively pulling away its business, that creates this huge industrial vacuum in the world. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Because this analysis argues that vacuum isn't going to be filled by Germany or Japan. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for an unexpected nation to become what the report calls a quasi-hegemonic industrial power.
And this really is the key question, isn't it? The West has clearly forgotten how to build things at scale. You know, big, hard things like ships, artillery, advanced microchips. So if there's this huge void, why is South Korea the one to fill it? I mean, what about industrial giants like Germany or Japan?
Well, let's start with Germany. They're being called the sick man of Europe again, which is pretty telling. Their entire economic model, which was built on cheap Russian gas and endless Chinese customers, has totally backfired. Their industrial base has just been hollowed out. Now, contrast that with South Korea, which this analysis says has an acceleration gene. They can adapt and execute plans with incredible speed, and they have the mass production capability that the West has completely lost.
Okay, so what about their regional rival, Japan? Japan has amazing technology, for sure, but this analysis points to what it calls an analog culture. Decision-making is really slow, it's all about consensus. And maybe even more importantly, they have severe labor shortages that just make it impossible to ramp up production quickly. South Korea, on the other hand, combines top-tier R&D with that incredible speed. And here's the kicker, it builds its defense systems to be fully NATO-compatible. It is basically ready to go right now.
Right, so this is the crucial point. South Korea seems to be the only US ally that has both the ability to mass-produce things and the high-tech R&D in the exact sectors the US desperately needs. So let's take a deep dive into these three areas, which are being called the K-arsenal. We're talking shipbuilding, defense, and semiconductors.
Let's start with shipbuilding, because, frankly, the US Navy is in a crisis. Just look at this chart.
Some estimates say China's naval shipyards have over 200 times the capacity of American yards. 200! But believe it or not, the bigger problem for the US isn't even building new ships. It's just fixing the ones they have. We're talking about nuclear submarines sitting in port for years, just waiting for repairs.
So, what's the solution? Enter the Korean shipbuilders. And Hanwha Ocean is playing this brilliantly. What they do? They went and bought the historic Philly shipyard, right on U.S. soil. This one move slots them directly into the U.S. Naval Industrial Base. It allows them to start bidding for those crucial maintenance and repair contracts. They're basically making themselves indispensable by fixing the very fleet that the U.S. can't seem to fix itself.
Okay, next up, defense. After the invasion of Ukraine, the whole world is rearming, and Western factories just can't keep up. For some companies, this has led to just pure dominance. Check this out. Hanwha Aerospace's K9 howitzer now has over 50% of the entire global market for this type of artillery. I mean, that's like iPhone-level market share. It's just become the gold standard, period.
And it's not just the K9. Hyundai Rotem's K2 tank is now the go-to alternative to the German Leopard. The Chunggung missile defense system from LIG Next One, people call it the Korean Patriot, is seeing huge demand, especially in the Middle East. And the advantage is always the same. They can deliver high-quality NATO-compatible gear faster and cheaper than anyone else in the world.
All right, finally, let's talk about the most futuristic piece to this K arsenal, semiconductors. Now, the US has put these really strict export controls on the equipment needed to make advanced chips, specifically targeting China. What this does is it creates something called a time subsidy. Think of it like a race. By intentionally tripping the runner right behind you, you give your preferred partner, in this case South Korea, a totally protected runway to go and dominate the next generation of technology without having to worry about subsidized Chinese competition.
And the key battleground right now, it's something called high bandwidth memory, or HBM. Let me be clear, you cannot have the AI revolution without this stuff. It is the super fast memory that feeds all those powerful NVIDIA GPUs. And right now, one company, SK Hynix, is the undisputed leader. They bet big, they partnered with NVIDIA early, and now they are completely sold out for the next 2 years. That's an incredible position to be in, and it's all protected by US national security policy.
So you've got the ships, the guns, and the chips. It sounds like a slam dunk for South Korea, right? But, this is a really complex relationship. It's full of risks, especially with all the political uncertainty in Washington. So let's look at how Korean companies are trying to navigate this new frenemy dynamic.
This table here really lays out the strategy perfectly. Let's take cars. The big risk, especially from a potential Trump administration, is universal tariffs. So what's the solution? Well, Hyundai and Kia are building absolutely massive factories in Georgia to build their cars in the US. They're also smartly pivoting to the hybrid cars that Americans actually want to buy right now. Now for batteries, the risk is that the big IRA subsidies could get cut, but the countermove is even stronger. A US ban on Chinese EV battery competitors is pretty much a given, which creates a protective moat around the Korean companies. It basically guarantees them the market because they're the only other ones who can supply at scale.
So when you put all of this together, the industrial power, the strategic alignment with the US, these clever risk mitigation plans, it's leading to a fundamental reevaluation of South Korea's place in the world, and of course, in investor portfolios. So let's talk about the money.
See, for decades, investors have talked about the Korea discount. It was this idea that Korean stocks were cheap for a reason, usually because of sketchy corporate governance. But that is starting to change. The government has this new Value Up program, and it's putting serious pressure on these big family-run companies to actually return value to shareholders through dividends and buybacks. That, plus a new wave of activist investors, is forcing some real, tangible change.
So let's just pull this all together one last time. The high-stakes game between the US and China is basically being decided by China's own structural problems. You could say the US won the macro battle, but in the process, it completely hollowed out its own industrial base. And who's stepping into that void? South Korea. It's becoming the factory for the free world, building the critical ships, guns, and chips that America's entire global strategy now depends on.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most important question. We've used the word linchpin a lot, but think about it. If the United States becomes completely dependent on Korean ships, Korean guns, and Korean chips to contain China, if it literally cannot run its Navy or its AI industry without Seoul, then who actually holds the leverage in this new alliance? Is the linchpin just another piece of the machine, or does it become the one thing that decides whether the machine runs at all?